welcome to My Baseball History, presented by the Shoeless Joe Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, Dan Wallach, and I'm also the executive director of the museum. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. So I might speak to a current or former player, manager, executive, or broadcaster. I may talk to a photographer, a journalist, an author, or historian. I could chat with a coach, a collector, a clubhouse attendant, or I think you get the idea. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. This introduction episode is something that will be a little bit different than all the other episodes to follow. In this episode, I'm going to introduce myself. I'll give you guys the shortened version of my baseball history, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the museum. All future episodes will have an interview with a guest, but this one will hopefully give you an idea of who I am, and it won't be quite as long as the other episodes. I grew up in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. I was born in 1986, and in the early 90s when I was starting to learn about baseball, I was very gently guided into being a White Sox fan by my dad. That's because he grew up in Queens, New York, which is the one part of New York that is predominantly Mets fans. So he was 12 years old in 1969 when his favorite team found themselves 10 games back of the division leader Chicago Cubs on August 14th. The amazing Mets won 14 of their last 17 games in August and 24 of their 32 games in September and October to finish the season with 100 wins and 62 losses, 8 games ahead of their hated division rivals in Chicago. The Miracle Mets went on to sweep the Braves in the NLCS and went on to beat the Baltimore Orioles in 5 games in the World Series, completing one of the most improbable seasons in baseball history. 2 years later, my dad's family moved to Chicago. So you've got to remember, this was pre-internet, this was pre-satellite TV, this wasn't so long after a time when people's phone numbers still had words in them. So it's not like my dad could really have followed his favorite team anymore, now that he lived half the country away. So as he saw it, he had 2 choices. He could either become a White Sox fan and root for the local team, or he could stop watching baseball altogether because he sure as hell wasn't going to root for the Chicago Cubs. Luckily for me, the mid-90s was a time when it was much more fun to be a White Sox fan than a Cubs fan. We had a great team full of exciting players. We had Frank Thomas, Robin Ventura, Tim Raines, Lance Johnson, Ozzie Guillen, Blackjack McDowell, Wilson Alvarez, Alex Fernandez. We even had Bo Jackson and Albert Bell for a little bit. We had a great broadcast team in Ken Harrelson and Tom Paciorek, or Hawk and Wimpy as they were affectionately known. Good guys really did wear black. And it was just a great time to be a sports fan in Chicago, with the Bulls winning championship after championship after championship after championship after championship, one more, right? After championship, yeah, that's right. And the White Sox winning the division in 1993, they fielded an exciting, competitive team year after year. I'm also a huge Michael Jordan fan. Growing up in Chicago, you kind of had to be. Luckily for me, the White Sox and the Bulls were both owned by Jerry Reinsdorf, because if MJ had retired from basketball that first time and gone into the Cubs organization, I'd have really had some soul searching to do. So anyway, as a family, we love sports. We love history. My mom is a huge Kennedy historian and has just always been super into doing research and learning about everything she can wherever she goes. For spring break one year, we took a family trip to Boston. Oh, how lovely, you may be thinking, but if you'll rewind 10 seconds, you'll notice that I did not say that we took a family vacation to Boston. No, we took a family trip to Boston. We walked the entire Freedom Trail, which is a 2.5-mile-long path that passes by 16 locations significant to the history of the United States, and we stopped in 19 of them. While at the time, it may not have been my number one choice for something to do on spring break from elementary school, trips like that definitely laid the groundwork for the way that I like to travel and do research now as an adult. More on that later. As a White Sox family and a family who loves history, of course, one of the things that you learn very early on is the story of Shoeless Joe Jackson and the players who were banned from the 1919 World Series team. The movies 8 Men Out and Field of Dreams each came out within a couple years of me being born, and I can't tell you the number of times I've seen them both throughout my life. In March of 2009, my parents had retired and moved from Chicago to Travelers Rest, South Carolina. A few months later in August, I came down to visit for a week. We'd all been reading and hearing about the new museum that had just recently opened that was dedicated solely to Shoeless Joe Jackson. So we did some research and found out that it was right across the street from Fluor Field in Greenville's historic West End. Fluor Field is the minor league stadium where the Greenville Drive play, and they're an affiliate of the Boston Red Sox. So with a week-long trip planned and nothing to do but kill time, we decided to go to a couple of Drive games and check out the museum. The Drive team that year featured a handful of guys who would eventually make it to the majors, including Ryan LaVarnway, Will Middlebrooks, and some guy named Anthony Rizzo. Before the game one day, we stopped in the museum to check it out. There were a handful of people inside already, so my parents and I just kind of started walking around and giving ourselves a self-guided tour. A few minutes later, an old woman came up to me and said, "You look like you play baseball." I was 22 at the time, so I said, "Yeah, I used to. It's been a few years, though." She said, "Great. Well, we have a game on Saturday, and it starts at 11 o'clock, so you should get there about 10. I was thinking to myself, okay, great. That's another day's activities planned out that we don't have to worry about now. And then she went on to say, there's also practice the night before. "Oh, you want me to play in this game?" "Yeah, why do you think I asked you?" Now, I hadn't remembered her actually asking me anything up until then, but that wasn't the point. I said, "I'm just here on vacation. I don't have my cleats or my glove or anything to wear or anything." She said, "That's okay. It's 1860 style rules, so no cleats are allowed anyways. You're not going to be playing with a glove. Just wear black pants, a white t-shirt, and we'll give you the hat on Saturday. We'll bring the bats and balls. It's going to be good." So it turns out that that woman was the curator of the museum, and the game that she was describing was the first annual vintage baseball game against the Cobb Museum from Georgia. We fielded a team representing our museum called the Joes, and the Cobb Museum fielded a team to represent their museum called the Georgia Peaches. They drove up 67 miles from Royston to play us at the Shoeless Joe Jackson Memorial Park in Greenville. That field is located just behind Brandon Mill, where Joe worked for part of his early life, and where he played ball for the Brandon Mill baseball team in the Textile League. We actually played on a field where Joe once played. It was amazing. And of all the people who participated in the event that year, 3 of them turned out to be some of the most renowned Joe Jackson experts on the planet. One was Mike Nola, who's been researching Joe's life and career literally longer than I've been alive. You might have visited Mike's website before, blackbetsy.com. If you haven't done that before, you should. Trust me, it's a wealth of knowledge and information. Tons of great photos, all sorts of great stuff. Another person who was there was Mike Miller, who has dedicated the last decade plus of his life to tracking down every single box score from every single professional baseball game that Joe ever played. He's compiled that information into a 1,500-page book, and I'm not exaggerating with any of that. Another person was Tom Perry, who was pretty much the authority on Textile League baseball and has had multiple books of his own published. As if that wasn't cool enough, there were also descendants from both Joe Jackson and Ty Cobb's family at the game, and one of them, Allison, even played on our team. I was instantly hooked. These were my people. This was the exact type of event that I was into. The game has continued every year since then, and although most of our team is made up of people who have played multiple years, I'm one of only a small handful of people who have played in every single game. One year we'll host the game in Greenville and the Peaches will come up and play us here. The next year the Cobb Museum hosts the game in Royston and we travel down to go play them there. The more we all talked with each other, the more we all learned about Joe and about the museum itself. It turned out the museum was actually one of Joe's old houses that he lived in, and it had been moved from its original location a few miles away to its new spot right across the street from the minor league stadium. The house was moved by Richard Davis, who is the president of Trademark Properties in Charleston, South Carolina. He went to Clemson University and is a proud South Carolinian. In 2006, he learned that Joe Jackson's old home, which was located at 119 East Wilburn Street in Greenville, was available. So, just like Joe and Katie Jackson had done in 1941, Richard bought the modest brick house. He went to the city of Greenville and basically said, "Hey, if you guys take care of finding a new place for me to put it, I'll pay to have the house moved anywhere in Greenville and then donate it to the city. The catch is, you've just got to turn it into a museum." So that's what happened. Later in 2006, the house was lifted up off its foundation on Wilburn Street, cut in half, and driven 2.1 miles down the road to its new home. It was pieced back together and underwent more than a year of substantial renovations, most of which were actually contributed by local companies. On June 21st, 2008, it opened as a museum where it was run by Bill and Arlene Markley. Rob Young from Borderland Comics and Games in Greenville came on board for a couple years to run things, and when Arlene retired in April of 2019, the board of directors called me and asked if I wanted to come take over. They'd known me for 10 years at that point and knew my love, my passion, and my knowledge of Joe Jackson. I had been bartending in Wrigleyville for the previous few years at a great family-owned bar on Clark Street called Yoxie's. If you're ever in Chicago, go there and get some Tangsy Q wings and tell them I sent you. I promise you won't be disappointed. Obviously, with the bar being about 500 feet away from Wrigley Field where the Cubs play, baseball season was our busy season. And with another move of the museum's building approaching, more on that in a minute, we all decided that it would make the most sense for me to actually stay in Chicago until the start of 2020, running social media and doing a lot of other things behind the scenes, like starting this podcast. My dad, Mike Wallach, became the managing director and kept the museum open during those interim months, along with the help of Mike Miller, Mike's wife Deborah Miller, and my mom Lori. They continued opening every Saturday, as had been the operating schedule at the museum for years, and they even accommodated private tours on other days and nights of the week. Without their help, the museum most likely would have closed. Back when Richard Davis approached the city of Greenville with his idea, Greenville's growth hadn't quite expanded out all the way to the West End, so the land where the museum was moved wasn't quite as valuable back then as it is today. They placed the museum right in the center of the hypotenuse of the triangular-shaped property closest to the baseball stadium. And now that Greenville has expanded out that way and is one of the fastest growing cities in the country, that land is much more valuable. In late 2018, early 2019, a development company based out of Charlotte approached the museum asking us if we would be willing to move our building again, so they could build a luxury apartment complex whose footprint would go directly over our current location. We couldn't possibly think of a better spot in all of Greenville for our museum to be, other than directly across the street from a baseball stadium, so we were pretty hesitant. The developers, who are a company called Woodfield Development, told us that they completely understood and that they only wanted to move us to the corner of the triangle, so we'd still be on the same side of the street, we'd still be directly across from Fluor Field. To thank us for accommodating them and their multi-million-dollar project, and to make up for the months of lost income that we would suffer while being closed, they offered us a package of things we would have otherwise never been able to afford. They told us that they would give us a new roof for the museum, a new HVAC system, and that they would build us an 837 square foot addition, which would essentially double our current size. Our only question after that was when exactly they wanted us to have our building empty so we could be ready for the move. We have a ton of great things planned and a lot of great new exhibits ready for when the museum does reopen. I've personally been collecting Shoeless Joe Memorabilia for years, and I'll be putting my collection on display, which includes original pages from the Jackson family scrapbook, original baseball cards of Joe, a vintage Louisville Slugger from the early 1910s with Joe's face and name on it back when he was still playing with Cleveland, and lots more. One of the things I've done over the past few years is to try to create a comprehensive Joe Jackson timeline. With the help of Mike Nola and Jacob Pomrenke, I've tried to fill in the gaps of their research and establish every place where Joe ever lived, worked, or played baseball throughout his entire life and career. If you guys don't know Jacob, he's the director of editorial content for the Society of American Baseball Research, and he's the chairman of SABR's Black Sox Scandal Research Committee. In addition to just creating a timeline, though, I've also gone on road trips to try to actually visit all of these places all over the country. Whenever I go somewhere new, I bring an empty jar with me, and I try to fill it with dirt from that specific spot. I've also tried to find original pictures or postcards from those locations, or take photos while I'm there to show what it looked like when Joe was standing in that same exact spot. It's a truly insane endeavor, and I'm well aware of that, but it's something that makes me feel more connected to Joe, since a lot of game-used or game-worn memorabilia of his doesn't really exist, and it's going to make for a really cool display at the museum. One of my prized possessions is a business card from Joe Jackson's liquor store in Greenville. Joe ran the liquor store with his wife, Katie, and it was very successful. Joe would hand out business cards to his clients, and to the best of our knowledge, there's only 2 known examples that have survived all these years later. The one that I have is the one that was in his wallet on December 5th, 1951, which was the day he died. I also have an original photo of him standing behind the counter at that liquor store, which we're going to blow up life-size to create a display in the museum. In that photo, Joe's resting his hand on a black cash register. I did hours and hours of research and reached out to a handful of experts and collectors in the cash register hobby, and yes, I was just as surprised as you are to find out that there is a cash register hobby, but I was finally able to verify the make and model of Joe's register in that photo. Apparently, it's a pretty unique one that was produced in 1938. I spent months trying to find one and finally came across a guy named Paul who lived in Milwaukee who had one. Since I was still in Chicago at the time, I made the drive up and picked it up in person. We'll have that on display at the museum in front of the life-size picture of Joe so people can stand behind it and recreate that image of him standing behind the counter. So that's the kind of really unique stuff that we have in store for the museum moving forward. And as this podcast goes on, I'll start and end each episode with a little bit about what's up with us and what we have in the pipeline. We also have big plans as members of the community that we're really excited about. We're working on partnerships with the local libraries to donate books and possibly create literacy programs since Joe was illiterate. We want to go around Greenville to the old ball fields that still exist from the Textile League days and renovate them into safe, usable diamonds again for the local kids. We know it's going to be a ton of work, but it's all in the name of Joe, and it's for the good of the community. The Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum and Baseball Library is a 501c3, which means we're a not-for-profit organization. So the only way that we make money is through sales in our gift shop or by accepting donations. If either of those sound like things you might want to do, you can visit us online at shoelessjoejackson.org, and there are links from the homepage to either get to our store or to make a donation. We'd also love it if you follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can find us everywhere at Shoeless Museum. So facebook.com/Shoeless Museum, twitter.com/Shoeless Museum, instagram.com/Shoeless Museum. You get it. I've also created social media accounts specifically for this podcast, and instead of being at Shoeless Museum on all platforms, it's at Shoeless Podcast. So pretty simple. If you want to write in and ask a question, you can do that on Twitter at Shoeless Podcast or by emailing shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. So shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. Hopefully you like the music that was played on this show too. The opening theme song was done by my friend Ryan Starinsky, who plays in my favorite band called The Sidekicks out of Columbus, Ohio. He also played the song that will end each episode, which you'll hear in a second. My friend Randy Moore did the other music you heard on this episode. Randy's in a band called Get Married, and they're from San Jose, California. He made a baseball organ version of one of their songs called Kingpin. So thank you very much to Ryan and Randy for making those for me, and please check out both of their bands if you have a chance. If you want to submit music for us to play on the podcast, or if you want to create little 5 to 10 second long bumps to introduce different segments that will start recurring the more episodes you listen to, feel free to email me those at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. The artwork for the podcast was done by the incredibly talented Gary Siridkowski. You can get in touch with him or see more of his work at his website, studiogaryc.com, where you can see his infinite baseball card set of baseball's forgotten heroes, including Negro League legends, barnstorming mercenaries, semi-pro sluggers, blacklisted bums, foreign phenoms, Bush League oddballs, and famous players before they were famous. Please like and subscribe to My Baseball History on whatever app, streaming service, or website where you're listening to this episode. That way you'll be notified when new episodes get posted. We'll do a new episode each week for the next 9 weeks to complete Season 1. Then starting in October, we'll do another 9-episode season. Same thing then, 1 episode per week. We'll continue on with that schedule of 1 season beginning in April, 1 season beginning in October, every year until we run out of people to talk baseball with. Also, please be sure to rate and review My Baseball History wherever you're listening to it. Those 5-star ratings help us reach a bigger audience, and we definitely appreciate that. I can't tell you how much it means to me that you took the time to listen to this episode, and I hope that you love the content that we're about to start giving you. We're going to have some really incredible interviews this season, and I promise you're going to learn something new in every single episode. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.